She was left bleeding in the brutal Wyoming sun, discarded like trash by a man who took her fortune and mocked her size. But out in the untamed wild, survival doesn't care about society's cruel standards. Sometimes, salvation comes riding down the mountain, carrying a rifle and a grudge. The jagged rocks of the Wind River Pass offered no comfort, only a slow, agonizing heat that baked the Wyoming dirt into a cracked mosaic. Beatrice Gallagher lay face down in the dust, the taste of copper and dry earth thick on her tongue. Her vision blurred, swimming with the blinding glare of the afternoon sun and the dark, terrifying edges of unconsciousness. Every breath was a battle against the searing pain in her ribs, fractured by the heavy, steel-toed boots of the man who had promised to love her. Arthur Pendleton. The name alone made bile rise in her throat. Just 48 hours ago, they had been traveling from Boston to San Francisco, ostensibly to start a new life together after her father's sudden passing. Beatrice was a wealthy woman, the sole heir to the Gallagher shipping fortune. But she was also a woman who had never fit the delicate, fragile mold of high society. She was heavy, broad-shouldered, and soft in a world that demanded women be corseted to the point of breaking. For years, she had endured the whispered insults, the polite sneers at dinner parties, the cruel caricatures. When Arthur, a handsome and seemingly earnest lawyer, had courted her, she had been foolish enough to believe he saw past her flesh. He hadn't. He had only seen the Gallagher bank accounts. As they crossed the desolate stretch of Wyoming, Arthur's mask had slipped entirely. The wagon had stopped. The driver, a hired thug named Cobb, had dragged her from the carriage. Arthur hadn't even looked her in the eye when he delivered the first blow. "You really thought I could love a pig like you be?" Arthur's voice echoed in her mind, a venomous hiss over the howling wind. "You're a joke, a fat, naive joke. When I tell them you slipped and tumbled down the ravine because you were too clumsy to hold your balance, they'll nod and offer me their pity." They had beaten her, stripped her of her jewelry, her father's pocket watch, and the leather satchel containing the deeds to her family's estate. Then, they had kicked her over the edge of a steep embankment, leaving her broken body to the coyotes. Now, hours or perhaps days later, Beatrice tried to move. Her heavy arms trembled, collapsing under her own weight. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear cutting a clean line through the dirt and dried blood on her swollen cheek. This was how she would die, alone, unloved, and betrayed. High above her on the ridge, the crunch of hooves on loose shale broke the eerie silence. Gideon Ross sat atop his massive draft horse, Samson, his sharp blue eyes scanning the canyon below. Gideon was a man carved from the very mountains he inhabited, tall, broad as an oak tree, with a thick beard and skin weathered to the texture of saddle leather. He had come out west to escape the noise of the civilized world, living as a trapper and guide, speaking more to the pines and the wolves than to any human being. A flash of blue fabric caught his eye near the bottom of the ravine. At first, he thought it was a discarded bedroll or a dead steer, but as he squinted against the sun, he saw the faint, desperate rise and fall of the shape. "Easy, Samson," Gideon murmured, his voice a low rumble. He dismounted, grabbing his Winchester rifle from the scabbard, and began the treacherous climb down the rocky slope. When he reached the bottom, Gideon stopped in his tracks. It was a woman. She was a large woman, dressed in a torn, expensive velvet traveling gown that was now ruined with blood and dirt. Her dark hair was matted to her scalp, her face bruised beyond recognition. Gideon knelt beside her, his massive, calloused hand hovering over her back before gently resting between her shoulder blades. He felt the shallow, ragged breath. "Ma'am?" he whispered gruffly. Beatrice flinched, a pathetic whimper escaping her cracked lips. She tried to curl into a ball, expecting another kick, another blow. "Easy now. I ain't gonna hurt you," Gideon said, keeping his voice steady and calm, the way he would speak to a wounded animal. He shifted around to look at her face. The cruelty inflicted upon her made his jaw clench. He had seen the aftermath of bar brawls and Indian skirmishes, but the beating of an unarmed woman boiled his blood in a way he hadn't felt in years. He reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap. Carefully, he slid his arm under her thick neck, supporting her head. Drink, just a little. Water touched Beatrice's lips, and she gasped, drinking greedily before coughing. She forced her eyes open. Through the swelling she saw a giant of a man, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He looked terrifying, wild and untamed, but the hands holding her were astonishingly gentle. "Who?" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Name's Gideon. You're in a bad way, ma'am. I need to get you up the ridge." Beatrice let out a sob, the reality of her physical form crushing her spirit once again. "You can't. I'm too heavy. Leave me. Just let me die." Gideon frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the deep-seated shame in her eyes, a shame that had nothing to do with her beating and everything to do with how the world had treated her. "I don't leave people to die," Gideon said flatly. "And I've packed out elk twice your size in the dead of winter. You ain't too heavy." Without waiting for another protest, Gideon stood. He whistled sharply, a piercing sound that echoed up the canyon. Samson, well-trained and sure-footed, slowly picked his way down the slope toward them. Gideon took a rope from his saddle, fashioning a makeshift harness. It took agonizing minutes, and Beatrice cried out in pain as he maneuvered her, but Gideon never cursed, never complained about her weight, and never made her feel like a burden. With a feat of raw, brute strength, he hoisted her up, securing her gently across the saddle. "Hold on," he instructed, walking beside the horse and keeping one strong hand firmly on her waist to ensure she didn't slip. "My cabin is 3 miles up the timberline. You just hold on to the mane." As they began the slow ascent into the dark pines, Beatrice finally surrendered to the darkness, slipping into unconsciousness with the steady, rhythmic sound of the man's boots crunching against the rocks. When Beatrice finally opened her eyes, the brutal glare of the sun had been replaced by the warm, flickering glow of a hearth fire. She was lying on a large, sturdy bed, covered in thick furs and woolen blankets. The smell of burning pine and rich, meaty stew filled the air. For a moment, panic seized her. She remembered the wagon, the dust, Arthur's laughing face. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her ribs forced her back down with a gasp. "Don't move." The voice came from the corner of the room. Gideon was sitting in a heavy wooden rocking chair, a knife in one hand and a piece of cedar in the other, whittling. He had taken off his hat, revealing thick, dark hair streaked with silver. In the firelight, the rugged lines of his face looked softer, though his eyes remained sharp and vigilant. "Your ribs are cracked," Gideon said, setting the wood down and standing up. He seemed to take up half the room. "Your arm is dislocated, though I popped it back into place while you were out. You've got a fever, but it broke an hour ago. You've been sleeping for 2 days." "2 days?" Beatrice whispered, her voice raspy. She looked down and realized her ruined velvet dress was gone. She was wearing an oversized flannel shirt that smelled of wood smoke and saddle leather. A fresh wave of humiliation washed over her. She pulled the heavy furs up to her chin, trying to hide her large frame. Gideon noticed the movement. He walked over to the stove, poured a mug of broth, and brought it to the bedside. "I cut the dress off you. Had to clean the wounds. Don't go worrying your head about modesty. I'm a solitary man, but I'm a respectful one." Beatrice took the mug with trembling hands, her swollen fingers struggling to grip the tin. Gideon didn't offer to feed her like a helpless child, but he stood close enough to catch the mug if she dropped it. "Thank you," she managed to say, taking a sip. The broth was rich and salty, and it felt like life pouring back into her veins. I don't know how to repay you. I have nothing. They took everything." "Who did?" Gideon asked, pulling a wooden stool up to the bed and sitting down. Beatrice hesitated. The humiliation of her story was almost as painful as her injuries, but looking into Gideon's steady, unjudging eyes, she found the courage to speak. "My fiancé," she said bitterly. "Arthur Pendleton. He only wanted my inheritance. When we got out into the middle of nowhere, he and the driver beat me. He took my family's deeds. He told me I was a joke, that everyone would believe I was too fat and clumsy to stay in the wagon. The tears came then, hot and fast, tracking down her bruised cheeks. She turned her face away to the log wall. He was right. I am a joke. Gideon's jaw tightened. The wood of the stool creaked under his weight as he leaned forward. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Beatrice slowly turned her head back. "A man who beats a woman and steals her livelihood ain't a man," Gideon said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He's a coward, and a coward's words are worth less than the dirt on my boots. You survived out there in the canyon. Most men would have died of shock. You ain't a joke, you're breathing." Beatrice stared at him, stunned. No one had ever spoken to her like this. In Boston, men had either ignored her entirely or spoken to her with dripping, condescending pity. Gideon spoke to her as an equal. Over the next week, Beatrice healed slowly. The cabin became her sanctuary. It was simple, built of thick logs and chinked with mud, but it was meticulously clean and functional. As her strength returned, Beatrice insisted on helping. Though she couldn't chop wood or hunt, she took over the cooking, using her knowledge of spices and herbs to turn Gideon's bland stews into rich, savory meals. She noticed Gideon watching her sometimes, not with the disgust she was accustomed to from men, but with a quiet, lingering appreciation. When she moved around the small kitchen, her full hips bumping the table, he never looked away in embarrassment. Instead, he seemed grounded by her presence in his solitary world. One evening, after they had finished eating, Gideon sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. Beatrice sat across from him, mending a tear in one of his heavy winter coats. "I need to go into South Pass City tomorrow," Gideon said casually, snapping the lever of the Winchester to check the action. "We're low on flour and coffee, and I need to get some liniment for your ribs." Beatrice froze, the needle slipping and pricking her finger. "South Pass City? Is it far?" "A half-day's ride. You'll be safe here. No one comes up this high on the ridge." "What if Arthur is there?" Beatrice's voice trembled. "What if he went to the authorities to report my accidental death?" "If he's there," Gideon said, his eyes darkening as he looked at her, "I'll handle him." "No." Beatrice dropped the coat, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You don't understand, Gideon. Arthur is a lawyer. He's connected. He has money now, my money. He can pay off sheriffs, judges, anyone. If you go after him, he'll have you hanged." "He don't know me," Gideon replied calmly. "I'm just a trapper buying coffee." The next morning, Gideon saddled Samson and rode down the mountain, leaving Beatrice with a loaded Colt revolver and strict instructions to keep the heavy wooden door barred. When Gideon reached South Pass City, the mining town was bustling with the chaotic energy of prospectors, merchants, and outlaws. He tied Samson to the rail outside the mercantile and stepped into the dusty street. He bought his supplies quietly, keeping his head down and his hat pulled low. But as he was leaving the general store, he passed the open doors of the Golden Fleece Saloon. A loud, booming voice drifted out over the piano music, a voice dripping with Eastern privilege and false charm. "Drinks for the house, gentlemen." Gideon paused, leaning against the wooden post of the boardwalk. Inside, a well-dressed man in a tailored suit was holding up a glass of whiskey, surrounded by a group of laughing roughnecks. "To new beginnings," the man declared. Gideon narrowed his eyes. He asked a passing miner who the man buying drinks was. "That's Mr. Arthur Pendleton," the miner said, wiping his mouth. "Just blew into town. Poor bastard lost his bride on the trail. Fell right out the wagon, they say. But he's sure eager to hire a search party to go back to the canyon." Gideon frowned. "Why send a search party if she's dead?" The miner chuckled. "Word is, the lady had the only key to a massive safety deposit box back in Chicago sewn into her corset. Pendleton says he needs her effects for sentimental reasons, but everyone knows he's looking for that key. He's offering $500 to whoever brings her body or that corset back to town." Gideon's blood ran cold. Beatrice hadn't just been left for dead. She was still a target. And Arthur Pendleton was about to send a hunting party right up into the Wind River Mountains. Gideon didn't wait to hear the rest of the miners' gossip. He turned on his heel, his heavy boots pounding against the wooden boardwalk, and vaulted onto Samson's back. He spurred the massive draft horse into a thunderous gallop, leaving the dusty streets of South Pass City in a cloud of churning grit. His jaw was set like granite. He knew men like Arthur Pendleton. They didn't care about the collateral damage. They only cared about the prize. And Arthur's prize was sitting by a hearth fire in a lonely cabin, entirely unaware of the target on her back. By the time Gideon reached the timberline, the sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple, signaling an incoming mountain storm. He burst through the cabin door, his chest heaving, the Winchester gripped tightly in his fist. Beatrice dropped the cast-iron skillet she was cleaning, the loud clatter echoing in the small room. "Gideon? What is it? What's wrong? Did you wear a corset when they threw you out of the wagon?" he demanded, barring the heavy oak door and sliding the iron bolt into place. Beatrice blinked, her cheeks flushing crimson. Yes. You said you cut it off me. Where is it?" "I threw it in the scrap bin near the woodshed," she stammered, confused and frightened by the raw urgency in his eyes. "Gideon, please, you're scaring me." Gideon didn't answer. He strode to the back corner of the cabin, shoved aside a pile of furs, and retrieved a heavy metal lockbox from beneath the floorboards. He began tossing boxes of ammunition onto the table. "Pendleton is in town. He's hiring a posse of cutthroats to come up the canyon. He's telling them you fell and died, but he's offering $500 for your body, or specifically, your corset." Beatrice stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. "My corset? But why?" "Because word is, you have a key sewn into it. A key to a safety deposit box in Chicago." Gideon paused, looking at her intently. "Did you?" Beatrice's breath hitched. Her mind raced back to her final days in Boston. Her father, his health failing, had handed her the heavily boned undergarment. "Wear this when you travel, Bee," he had wheezed. "The deeds are in the satchel for show, but the real power stays close to your heart. Arthur is a charming boy, but a father knows." "My father," Beatrice whispered, tears welling in her eyes as the profound realization washed over her. "He didn't trust Arthur. The deeds Arthur stole, they're worthless without the master ledger and the bank drafts in that deposit box. And the only way into that box is the key." "Then we have an advantage," Gideon said, tossing her the Colt revolver. "But we're out of time." A low, ominous crack echoed through the pines outside. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. Gideon extinguished the oil lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the dying embers in the hearth. "Get behind the stove," he ordered, his voice a calm, deadly whisper. "It's thick cast iron. It'll stop a bullet." Beatrice scrambled behind the heavy stove, her heart hammering against her ribs so fiercely she feared the men outside could hear it. She gripped the heavy Colt with trembling, sweat-slicked hands. Outside, the wind began to howl, driving rain against the log walls. Over the storm, a cruel, familiar voice barked a command. "Spread out! Check the outhouse and the shed. If the trapper's in there, burn him out. We just need the woman's clothes." It was Cobb, Arthur's brutal driver. "You ain't burning anything on my mountain," Gideon muttered. He slid the barrel of his Winchester through a narrow firing slit he had carved between the logs years ago for fending off mountain lions. He didn't wait for them to make the first move. Gideon took a breath, aimed at the shadowed figure holding a torch near the woodshed, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. The man outside screamed, the torch tumbling to the wet earth as he fell, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted. Gunfire peppered the front of the cabin, the heavy lead slugs thudding harmlessly into the thick, mud-chinked logs. Gideon worked the lever of his rifle with terrifying speed and precision, moving from window to firing slit, returning fire only when he had a guaranteed target. He was a phantom in the dark, a force of nature protecting his domain. "Rush the door," Cobb roared from the tree line. "He can't shoot all of us." 3 men charged the porch. Gideon dropped one before he reached the steps, but the other 2 slammed heavily against the oak door. It shuddered, the iron bolt groaning under the impact. "Beatrice!" Gideon yelled. Before the door could splinter, Beatrice rose from behind the stove. She didn't cower. The weeks of healing, the mountain air, and the realization of her own strength culminated in this single moment. She leveled the heavy Colt with both hands, aimed at the center of the door, and pulled the trigger. The gun roared, kicking violently in her grip. The bullet punched clean through the wood. A heavy thud sounded on the porch, followed by the frantic scrambling of the remaining man retreating into the mud. Silence fell over the ridge, save for the pouring rain. "Cobb!" one of the surviving mercenaries yelled from the dark. "This ain't worth 500. The trapper's a dead shot, and they got an army in there. I'm out!" The sound of retreating horses echoed down the trail. Cobb, bleeding from a graze on his cheek and realizing his posse had abandoned him, cursed fiercely before scrambling onto his own mount and disappearing into the blackness of the storm. Gideon slowly lowered his rifle. He walked over to Beatrice, taking the smoking Colt from her shaking hands. He looked at the bullet hole in the door, then down at her. A slow, deeply impressed smile cracked through his thick beard. "I think you got him," Gideon said softly. Beatrice exhaled a shaky breath, a sudden wild laugh escaping her lips. "I think I did." The morning sun broke over the Wind River range, washing the rain-slicked pines in brilliant golden light. Beatrice stood on the porch, wearing one of Gideon's spare coats over her trousers. In her hand, she held a small brass key washed clean of mud and blood, retrieved from the scrap bin at first light. Gideon led Samson and a second, sturdy mare up to the porch. "You don't have to do this," he told her, tightening the cinch on the saddle. "We can ride north, head to Montana. He'd never find you." "No," Beatrice said, her voice steady and resolute. She looked out over the vast expanse of the valley. She was no longer the broken, humiliated woman bleeding in the dust. She was Beatrice Gallagher, and she was done hiding. "Arthur tried to strip me of my dignity, my fortune, and my life. If I run, he wins. I'm taking back what belongs to me." Gideon nodded slowly, his eyes shining with profound respect. "Then we ride into town." South Pass City was busy with the midday rush when Gideon and Beatrice rode down the main thoroughfare. The mud from the previous night's storm sucked at the horses' hooves. They stopped in front of the Golden Fleece Saloon. Through the large glass windows, Beatrice could see Arthur. He was sitting at a felt-covered poker table, immaculately dressed, laughing as he flashed a wad of stolen Gallagher money. Beatrice dismounted. She didn't wait for Gideon. She pushed through the swinging saloon doors, the wood slapping loudly against the walls. The piano player faltered. The low hum of conversation sputtered and died. Arthur, sitting with his back to the door, turned around in irritation. "What is the—" The words died in his throat. The cigar slipped from his fingers, falling onto his expensive trousers. His face drained of color, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Beatrice walked slowly toward his table. She stood tall, her broad shoulders squared, her presence commanding the entire room. She didn't shrink away from the stares of the miners and cowboys. She let them look. "Hello, Arthur," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent saloon. "B," Arthur stammered, stumbling backward out of his chair. He bumped into the bar, his eyes wide with disbelief. You fell." "The wagon. I was pushed," Beatrice corrected loudly, ensuring every man in the room heard her. "Beaten and left for dead by a coward who wanted my father's money." Whispers erupted across the room. Several men stood up, glaring at Arthur. "She's lying," Arthur shrieked, his polished veneer cracking into desperate hysteria. "She's a mad woman. Cobb! Where is Cobb?" Cobb ran. A deep, booming voice announced. Gideon stepped through the saloon doors, his massive frame blocking the sunlight. He rested his hand casually on the butt of the revolver at his hip. He decided the Wyoming mountains were a bit too treacherous. Arthur's eyes darted frantically around the room, looking for an exit. Realizing he was trapped, panic overtook him. He reached inside his velvet coat, pulling a silver derringer. Before he could even level the tiny pistol, Gideon moved with terrifying speed. He didn't draw his gun. Instead, he crossed the room in 2 massive strides, grabbed Arthur by the lapels, and hurled him violently onto the poker table. The wood splintered under the impact, chips and cards raining down. Gideon pinned the gasping lawyer by the throat, prying the derringer from his hand and tossing it across the floor. "Marshal!" someone yelled from the doorway. Marshal Higgins, a grizzled lawman with a star pinned to his vest, pushed his way into the saloon. "What in the hell is going on here?" Beatrice stepped forward. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key, slamming it down onto the bar counter. "Marshal, my name is Beatrice Gallagher. That man is Arthur Pendleton. He assaulted me, stole my carriage, and attempted to murder me for my family's inheritance. I have the bank codes, the key, and the scars to prove every word." The marshal looked at Beatrice, then at the quivering, pathetic form of Arthur pinned beneath the mountain man. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Well, Mr. Pendleton," the marshal said dryly, pulling a pair of heavy iron cuffs from his belt. "Looks like your mourning period is officially over. Get up." Arthur sobbed as he was dragged to his feet and shackled, his cries for mercy echoing hollowly against the wooden walls as the marshal hauled him out the door. The saloon remained quiet for a moment before the bartender cleared his throat and offered Beatrice a complimentary glass of cider. She accepted it with a gracious nod. Gideon walked up beside her, leaning his elbow on the bar. "You handled yourself well, Miss Gallagher. Your fortune is safe. You can buy a ticket back to Boston on the morning stage." Beatrice looked down into her glass, swirling the amber liquid. Boston. The ballrooms. The tight corsets. The cruel whispers behind fans. The oppressive gray skies. She looked up at Gideon. She saw the wild mountains in his eyes, the fierce loyalty, and the quiet, undeniable warmth that had brought her back from the brink of death. "I don't think I want to go back to Boston," Beatrice said softly. She reached out, her soft, scarred hand covering his large, calloused one. "I have enough money to buy half the valley up by the ridge, if you wouldn't mind a neighbor. Or perhaps a partner." Gideon looked at her hand resting on his, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his weathered face. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers securely through hers. "I reckon," Gideon murmured, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "That'd be just fine. Did you enjoy this Wild West tale of survival and justice? If you loved seeing Beatrice take back her power and find true love in the rugged mountains, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love a good historical drama, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, original audio stories delivered. Drop a comment below to let us know your favorite moment.